In the last chapter, we talked about how firms make production decisions in perfectly competitive markets. Now, we'll go to the other end of the spectrum and talk about how firms make production decisions in a monopoly. So a monopoly is sort of the opposite type of market from a perfectly competitive market. So in a perfectly competitive market, we had lots of competitors, lots of buyers, lots of sellers. And in a monopoly market, we just have a single firm. So we have a single firm that sells a product without close substitutes. And they have some way of preventing entry by new firms. And so they never end up having competition, or rarely end up having competition. Monopoly power, then, is the power that they have. So they have this ability to set the price of a good or service. So remember, in a perfectly competitive market, we said that firms were just price takers. They take the price from the market, and that's all they can do. No one has any control over raising or lowering the price. So a monopolist does have some control over raising or lowering the price, but as we will see, that control is still limited to what the customer is willing to pay. And so their only real control over the price is in that they can control their output, right? So they decide how much they're going to produce, and then when they decide that, the market will then tell them, okay, what are people willing to pay for it then? But when they change how much they produce, they will change the price, the market price. Unlike in a perfectly competitive market where changing your quantity produced has no effect on the price that you're able to charge. So monopoly is a single firm selling a product without close substitutes, so people can't go somewhere else to get it. And they have some way of preventing entry by new firms, which is called a barrier to entry. So barriers to entry are restrictions that make it difficult for new firms to enter a market. And these restrictions would be really high. These barriers would be really high in the case of a monopoly. So some of these barriers are natural barriers that just sort of occur naturally in a market, like control of resources. So if, for example, you are a company that owns all of the diamond mines in the world, then you have a monopoly over the sale of diamonds because you control the resources, the mines that are required to produce sellable diamonds. Another natural barrier to entry is if a particular market or people in a particular market have problems raising capital. So if it's difficult to enter the market because it takes some large amount of upfront capital and an upfront investment, and it's hard to raise that investment. Maybe you're in a market where it just takes a lot of upfront investment and it's hard to get that. Maybe you're in a market that's somewhat new and you're having to convince people to invest, and that's hard. So for whatever reason in your market, you might have problems raising capital, which sort of then is a good segue into the third one, which is where it can be related, which is economies of scale. So remember, we've talked about in the previous videos that over the long term, as a firm increases the scale of their business, increases the quantity that they produce and sell, then we can see different economies of scale. So economies of scale means you increase your output and at the same time you're decreasing the average cost of production. So when that is the case for a particular market, it can be really hard for new companies to break in at that high average cost level because an older company that's already larger has made it down the road to where they're experiencing economies of scale and they have lower average costs. And this is called a natural monopoly. So an example of this is something like electricity provision, right? So this is a market where the first firm who enters this market does all this work of putting up electric poles, running electricity lines, maybe burying them, maybe running them on poles, but getting the electric grid to everyone's home. And once you've done that, the average cost of adding a customer is pretty low. You have great economies of scale. Your initial costs, the first few customers, cost you a lot per customer, but as you add customers, once you've sort of got your grid established, adding customers is a pretty low average cost, marginal cost to add those new customers. But if a new company wanted to come in and compete, say with Georgia Power or some big power company that already has an existing grid, that new company would be coming in and starting from scratch, having to put up all their poles and run their electricity grid to everyone's house. And so they would be coming in at that really high cost point while their competitor who's there and established has really low cost per customer. And so you'd be trying to compete with a company that's already established and has experiencing economies of scale while you're trying to get on your feet with these super high costs. And so it's really hard to enter a market like that when the existing firm already is down the road enough to have those low average costs. And if you wanted to come in, it'd just be your costs would be out of sight compared to theirs, and it would be really hard to compete. So that's called a natural monopoly, and it happens in those types of markets like electricity provision, a lot of utilities, where there's this sort of high upfront costs, and then after that you have lower costs per customer. So a natural monopoly is a place where a market that just sort of naturally has this quality about it, that just because of whatever it is you're selling, and because of the nature of the market, it's hard to get in because of economies of scale. So these are natural barriers to entry. There also are government-created barriers to entry, like licensing, where the government gives an exclusive right to sell a good or service. Pros and cons. So licensing, the con of any of these is going to be that we've limited competition and maybe keeping prices high for customers. But the pro is with licensing. So if you think about what types of markets involve licensing, things like doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, right? So these types of markets, real estate, things where it requires a license in order to sell something. The pro of that is it gives the customer some sort of assurance that the person they're dealing with kind of knows what they're doing in these markets where it's important that the person you're dealing with knows what they're doing. Also, things like radio, where you get a license and a right to a particular wavelength, right? A particular radio station. The pro of that is that we don't have folks fighting over each other, where when you turn on the radio, you hear 5 different radio stations at once and you can't really enjoy any of them. We have people limited in the scope of what they can do. Another government-created barrier to competition is a patent or copyright, right? So this is where the government gives people a right to be the only one, the exclusive person to sell whatever it is they're selling, at least for a period of time. Cons, again, limits competition, might mean prices are higher for the customer, but the pro is that it encourages creativity. It encourages people to do the sorts of research and development that it takes to come up with things like new pharmaceuticals, right? So sometimes it takes years or decades to come up with a drug to help cure or to help with a very serious medical issue. And no one would spend all that time working on a product if they knew that as soon as they developed it, it would get ripped off and sold by another company under another label. So the fact that we have these sort of protections that say, if you spend the time and the money to come up with the solution to this problem, then we'll protect your rights to be the only one to sell it so that you can make that money back. That encourages that sort of engineering and research and development. Similar with artists, musicians. You would never put out your art if you knew that it would just get ripped off and you wouldn't make any money off of it, right? And so this is why we have copyrights on that material, is to encourage that kind of creativity.